Now, I've talked about before Peter's character, and I think I can associate a lot with Peter's character. Peter had a tendency to speak when he shouldn't speak. He had a tendency sometimes to just run his mouth. He had a tendency sometimes to stick his foot in his mouth when he should just be quiet. And what we see in this text is nothing short of Peter's character. Verse 4 tells us that as they stood there in amazement, Peter couldn't just be satisfied with the privilege of being in the glorious appearance of Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. He felt like he needed to do something. So in Peter's attempt to do something in that moment of standing in the glory of God, he offers to build 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. What Peter was suggesting was we should build a shelter or a tabernacle or a shrine for all 3 of you. A place of memorial to each one of you, Jesus, Elijah, and Moses. He wanted to build a temple for them. But I imagine, even though Jesus doesn't respond, I imagine Peter keeps on talking. Because sometimes we don't know when we should be quiet, right? In verse 5, we're told that while Peter was still talking, the voice of the Lord thundered from heaven. While Peter was still talking, the voice of the Lord thundered from heaven. Peter is trying to come up with an earthly solution to what he thought was a man-made need, and God has to cut him off. When Peter doesn't know what to do, he thinks he needs to do something, and God has to cut him off. I'm thankful for the times that God has cut me off, that God has interrupted my plans, when he reminds me who's in charge, and it ain't me. Sometimes God gives us direction, and we want to argue with him about it. Sometimes God gives us instructions, and we want to argue about it, and we need to tell him why he's wrong and why we're right. And sometimes God has to simply look at us and say, would you just be quiet? Would you shut your mouth? God, would you interrupt us when we get in the way? Would you get in our way when we are outside of your will? I know some of you have probably heard about this revival that's taking place on a college campus. I was talking about it this morning at Ashbury College, a revival that's taking place. You know what has really bothered me? Followers of Jesus Christ that are going, no, that can't be right. That can't be, they can't do it that way. You didn't do it this way. You didn't do it the right way. Oh, you're supposed to follow this prescribed plan. And God's going, hush. This was my plan. When we don't want to get in God's way, when we start doing things outside of God's will, without consulting him first, God, would you cut us off when that happens? Church, don't let your solutions get in the way of God's sovereignty and God's plan.